52 years I have carried this, not because someone asked me to, not because of any agreement or professional obligation, because some things you carry simply because they are heavy and the weight of them is the proof that they happened. My name is James Kim. I am 85 years old. I was 33 in 1972, sitting in the seventh row of the Tonight Show studio at NBC in Burbank when Dolph Lundgren refused to shake Bruce Lee's hand on live television in front of 400 people. I watched what happened on the stage. I followed the people who would let me follow, and I stood in a corridor 20 feet from a room where what happened next happened. I have told pieces of this story to 3 people in 52 years. This is the first time I am telling all of it.
I need to tell you who Dolph Lundgren was in 1972, because the version of him that most people know came later, came from a career that was still assembling itself when this happened, and the 1972 version is the version that matters for understanding everything that followed. He was 19 years old. He had been training in Kyokushin karate since he was 13, which meant 6 years of the most contact-intensive version of competitive karate in existence, full-force striking to the body, head kicks that land rather than stop short, conditioning that Kyokushin practitioners described to everyone who hadn't experienced it as something that couldn't be communicated in words. He had won his first regional title at 16. By 19 he had won 3, had gone undefeated in tournament competition for 2 years, and was building the reputation in European martial arts circles that would eventually produce the career most people know him for. He was 6 feet 5 inches tall. He weighed 240 pounds. He moved with the specific combination of physical confidence and genuine physical capability that comes when a very large person has also spent 6 years becoming very capable, the combination that makes rooms adjust to a person rather than the person adjusting to the room. He had come to Los Angeles 6 months before that Thursday, on the combination of things that brought serious martial artists to Los Angeles in 1972, which was the intersection of the growing American interest in competitive karate and the connections that European champions were making with American promoters who saw something worth developing. He had been to several events, demonstrated at 2 dojos, and was building the American portion of what he was building with the methodical patience of someone who has a long-term plan and is executing it. He had been booked on The Tonight Show through a contact who knew Fred de Cordova, and the booking was for him to talk about Kyokushin, to demonstrate some techniques, to represent something that most American audiences hadn't seen explained clearly. Fred was collecting these segments the way a collector acquires things, adding to a growing picture of the martial arts world that he thought American television was only beginning to understand. What Dolph did not know until he arrived at the studio that Thursday afternoon was that there was a second guest. I was in the 7th row for different reasons. I had come to America from South Korea 5 years earlier, was working as an engineer at a company in Torrance, and had won the tickets in a contest my company ran for employee appreciation events. I had been to the show once before, years earlier, and I had liked the experience of the live studio, the specific quality of something happening in real time that you were present for, rather than watching through a screen. I knew who Bruce Lee was. I had grown up watching Hong Kong films in Seoul, and Bruce Lee's name was not unfamiliar to me in the way it was unfamiliar to most of the American audience that night. I recognized the name on the program listing for the surprise guest slot, and I sat forward in my seat. The man next to me in the 7th row, an American, mid-40s, who had come with his daughter, asked me if I knew who Bruce Lee was. I said yes. He asked who. I said I would tell him afterward, because it was better to see for yourself. The show started at 8:30. Johnny's monologue was good, the room warm from it by the time the first guest came out. Dolph Lundgren came through the curtain, and the audience gave him the response that a 19-year-old Kyokushin champion received in 1972 from an American audience that had never heard of Kyokushin, which was polite and interested. He was physically striking in the way that made rooms notice immediately, the combination of size and movement that told you before he said a word that the body had been built for something specific. He sat down and Johnny welcomed him, and they started talking. He was good on camera for someone his age. Specific about the training, clear about the principles, able to explain Kyokushin to an audience that had no reference point for it. He talked about full contact, about the conditioning, about what it meant to train in a system where the techniques were tested against real resistance every day rather than in controlled non-contact environments. He was making an argument, gently but consistently, about the difference between martial arts that worked in real conditions and martial arts that had been adapted for safer or more aesthetic applications. Johnny asked him to demonstrate something. He stood up and threw a combination in the open space beside the couch, a front kick to a roundhouse, both techniques thrown at real speed rather than demonstration speed, and the sound of them traveling through the air reached the 7th row and told you the speed was not performed. The audience reacted the way audiences react to something genuinely fast, when they haven't been prepared for how fast genuine speed is. He sat back down. Johnny asked about competitive Kyokushin, about the full contact format, about what 2 years of undefeated competition had produced in terms of his understanding of what worked and what didn't. Dolph said, "Everything I know comes from being tested. Every technique I use has been tested against a real opponent under real conditions. I don't know how to evaluate a technique I haven't tested. I don't think you can." The audience received this as the observation it was, a serious practitioner, making a point about the relationship between training and application that was interesting and not yet pointed at anything specific. Then Johnny said the thing he said. He looked at the camera and said the name, and the curtain opened. Let me tell you what happened in the 7th row, when Bruce Lee walked through that curtain. The man next to me, the American who had asked who Bruce Lee was, made a sound, not a word. A sound, the sound of someone who had seen something on a screen many times and is now seeing it in the same physical space as themselves for the first time. The sound of the gap between screen and person closing suddenly. His daughter grabbed his arm. The wave of recognition that moved through that studio was the specific wave I had heard once before when I'd been to an event where someone very famous walked in unannounced. The wave that starts in the places where the people who know are sitting and travels outward through the people who are learning from the people who know, and by the time it reaches the back, the whole room is making the same sound. Bruce walked out, and he moved the way he always moved, the quality I had read about and now was seeing, the specific economy of movement that the people who watched him tried to describe and couldn't quite and that you understood the moment you saw it in person. He went to the desk and shook Johnny's hand and said something brief and turned toward the couch. He extended his hand to Dolph Lundgren. What happened in the next 3 seconds, I have replayed in my memory more times than I have replayed anything else from my life, and the version I always come back to is the version where I am watching Dolph Lundgren's face rather than Bruce Lee's hand. Because what Dolph's face did in those 3 seconds was not what the face of someone who is simply missing the gesture does. Missing a gesture has a specific look, the look of inattention, the look of someone whose eyes were pointed elsewhere, the look of someone who catches up to what happened a second after it's over and feels the mild awkwardness of having missed a social moment. That was not what I saw. What I saw was a deliberate redirect. Eyes that had been looking at Bruce's extended hand moved away from it, moved toward the audience, the specific move of a person who has seen the thing they were looking at and has decided not to respond to it. The decision visible in the movement, in the precision of the redirect, in the way the rest of Dolph's body stayed perfectly still while only the eyes moved. He did not take the hand. Bruce's hand hung in the air for a moment. Then Bruce lowered it and sat down. The 7th row felt what happened before we could process it, the way the body registers something before the mind has caught up to the description of it. The man next to me stopped mid-breath. His daughter looked at me as though I might be able to explain what she had just seen. Johnny Carson's face did the thing. If you watched Johnny Carson on television regularly in those years, you knew the thing, the specific, almost imperceptible adjustment of expression that he made when something occurred on his stage that he hadn't planned for and was now managing. A tightening, very small, around the eyes, and then the professional composure reasserting itself smoothly over the top of it like a cover, returning to a pot, and then the voice, finding the frame that made whatever had just happened fit inside the shape of the evening. He said, "Well, 2 of the most impressive martial arts practitioners in the world on the same couch. I'm very much looking forward to this conversation." The audience responded to the warmth in his voice by providing the warmth that was being requested, which is what audiences do for Johnny Carson, because he had spent 11 years making them understand that his requests were reasonable. But the 7th row knew. The people close enough to have seen clearly knew. And I think, from the way the ambient noise of the studio settled into something slightly more taut than before, that more of the room knew than was showing it. Johnny asked Dolph what he made of the news about Bruce's work, about the growing presence of Hong Kong cinema in American popular culture, the wave that Enter the Dragon was going to ride to enormous success once it came out that fall. Dolph said, "I've watched some of what's come out of Hong Kong recently. The athleticism is real, the techniques are real. What I'm less sure about is the application." Johnny said, "What does that mean?" Dolph said, "It means I can't evaluate a fighter by watching a film. I can evaluate a fighter by watching them fight. And what I see in films is choreography. That's not disrespect, that's just an honest description of what film fighting is." The audience murmured. Interested, not hostile. Bruce said, "That's accurate. Film fighting and real fighting are different things." Dolph looked at him. Something moved in his expression when Bruce agreed. Something slight, the adjustment of someone who had expected pushback and didn't get it, and isn't sure what to do with the space where the pushback was supposed to be. He said, "So you agree?" Bruce said, I agree that they're different things. I disagree with the implication that the difference tells you anything about the fighter. Dolph said. What implication? Bruce said. The implication that someone whose work appears in films is necessarily on the film fighting side of the distinction, rather than the real fighting side. The film is the frame. What the film contains depends on the person in it. Dolph said. And what are you containing? If you think that was where things got pointed, you were watching the opening act. Bruce said. What would you like to know? Dolph said. I'd like to know what 20 years of training in a style that's been adapted for camera looks like against 6 years in a full contact system that's never been adapted for anything. The audience went quiet, not the comfortable quiet of a room watching a conversation. The tight quiet of a room that has just heard something and is deciding what to do with it. Johnny said, I think what Dolph is asking. Dolph said, I'm asking directly. I'm not asking for interpretation. He looked at Bruce. He said, You're famous. You're probably the most recognizable martial artist in the world right now. People watch your films and they see things that look extraordinary, and I want to know honestly, not for television, not for the audience, whether what they're seeing is what you can actually do, or whether it's what you and a camera operator and an editor produce together. The room produced a sound that was more complicated than a gasp and less organized than a reaction. 400 people simultaneously, doing different versions of the same thing, which was processing the sentence they had just heard and deciding how to receive it. Bruce looked at Dolph. He said, That's an honest question. Dolph said, I'm asking it honestly. Bruce said, Before the first film, I had been training every day for 15 years. I have students who hold professional titles in karate, judo, wrestling, and boxing. What appears in films is a fraction of what the training is. The training is not designed for cameras, and it doesn't require cameras to be what it is. Dolph said, Can I ask you something? Bruce said, Please. Dolph said, When you didn't get your handshake back at the beginning of this segment, the room went silent. A different silence from any of the previous ones. The silence of 400 people who had been watching something and have just watched the person they were watching name it out loud. Dolph said, I want to explain something about that. I don't bow to people I don't know. I don't shake hands as a performance of respect I don't have yet. Respect in the tradition I train in is earned through what you can do, not through what you're famous for. You walked out here and Johnny announced you, and the room responded, the way the room responds to a celebrity, and you offered me a hand, and I looked at that hand and I thought, I don't know what that hand can do. I know what it looks like in a film, that's not the same thing. He paused. He said, That's what the handshake was, or wasn't. Bruce said, very quietly, I understand that. Dolph said, Do you? Bruce said, I've spent 20 years watching people decide what I am before they know what I am. The handshake felt like that to you. I understand why it did. I don't agree with the conclusion you drew from it. Dolph said, What conclusion? Bruce said, That what I've built isn't worth the gesture. The room received this. The specific weight of a sentence that is precise and direct and doesn't have anywhere easy to go. Dolph said, I didn't say that. Bruce said, Your hand told me. And that sentence is the one that changed the temperature of the room. 7 words, said at a conversational volume, without any theatrical weight behind them, without anything performed or heightened about their delivery. 7 words that were so specifically true about what had happened and what it meant that the room had no available response except silence. Johnny said, Why don't we? Dolph said, No. Johnny stopped. Dolph said, I want to address this. I have been on this stage for 20 minutes, making a genuine argument about what martial arts legitimacy looks like when it's tested rather than when it's filmed, and I want to know whether the person across from me is willing to engage with that argument seriously rather than finding a way to reframe it that makes me the problem. Bruce said, What would engaging with it seriously look like? Dolph said, It would look like getting off this couch and showing me what you have. If you think the room was quiet before, what happened when Dolph finished that sentence was a different order of quiet entirely. The kind of quiet that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of 400 people choosing not to make any. Johnny stood up. He said, with the voice of a man who has decided that the professional authority of the request is the only available tool and is using all of it, Nobody is getting off any couch. We are going to continue this as a conversation, and I am asking both of you, as your host, to stay seated. Dolph said, I'm not doing anything that hasn't already been proposed. Johnny said, Nothing has been proposed. Bruce said, He proposed something. Johnny said, Nobody proposed anything. Bruce said, To Dolph, you want to know what the training produces in conditions that aren't controlled. Dolph said, Yes. Bruce said, There's a corridor behind this stage. Johnny said, There is no corridor that anyone is going to. Neither of them was looking at Johnny. The crew members at the edges of the studio were already in motion, the professional response of people who have been trained to move when a situation reaches a specific threshold, and several of them were moving now. A security person near the stage entrance had shifted from his position. Fred de Cordova was coming off the production platform in the focused, rapid way that meant he had made a decision and was executing it. Dolph stood up. He did it the way large people with trained bodies stand up, with complete control, no hurry, the movement of someone for whom standing up from a seated position is not a significant physical event, regardless of what follows it. He was 6 feet 5 inches when he was sitting. Standing, he occupied a different category of space. Bruce stood up. He stood up the way he did everything, and I want to try again to describe this, because I watched it from the 7th row, and it was the first time I had ever seen it in person, rather than through a screen. And what I noticed was the absence of a particular thing that is present when most people stand up in a tense situation, which is the preparation for it, the gathering, the slight additional effort that a body makes when it understands that the standing has a purpose beyond simply not sitting anymore. Bruce stood up the way you stand up when you are going from one room to another room, for no particular reason. The complete absence of preparation in the movement was itself a communication. Johnny said, in the voice of a man who has exhausted diplomatic tools and moved to direct instruction, "I need you both to sit down, or I need you to leave the stage." Neither of them sat down. Dolph said something to Bruce that I couldn't hear from the 7th row. Bruce said something back. Fred de Cordova reached the couch and said something to both of them that was brief and direct and that I also couldn't hear. Dolph looked at Fred for a moment and then looked at Bruce. Bruce was already walking toward the side entrance. Walking, not hurrying, the same quality of movement as everything else. Dolph followed. 3 crew members moved to intercept and didn't intercept. The security person by the stage entrance was saying something into a radio. 2 more security people were moving from the back of the studio toward the stage. Johnny looked at the camera. He said, in the specific voice of a man who has decided that honesty is the only available frame for what his studio has just done, "We are going to take a very brief break." I got out of my seat. I moved along the 7th row toward the aisle as quickly as I could, without stepping on anyone's feet, and I went toward the stage entrance at the left side of the studio. There was a security person there who was focused on the corridor he'd just watched 2 people disappear into, and I moved through the entrance behind him while his attention was pointed elsewhere. The backstage corridor was narrow and fluorescent lit, and smelled like the working parts of a building, rather than the public parts of one. I could hear voices ahead of me, one voice specifically, Dolph Lundgren's, because his voice, at normal volume, was large enough to carry through a corridor at some distance. I came around a corner and found the edge of what was happening. The staging area was a large, open-floored space used for set storage and equipment between shows. The ceiling was high, the floor was rubber, and the lighting was the flat industrial kind that makes everything look slightly less real than it is. Bruce was in the center of it, Dolph was across from him. Around the edges of the room, 4 or 5 crew members and 2 security people who had arrived ahead of me were positioned in the specific way of people who have decided they cannot stop something and are witnessing it instead. I positioned myself at the entrance to the room, between a road case and the wall, which gave me a sight line to most of the space without putting me in the middle of it. Dolph said, "Let's see what 20 years looks like." Bruce looked at him. He said, "You're going to be disappointed." Dolph said, "By what?" Bruce said, "By how little you'll be able to remember of it afterward." Dolph moved first. He moved the way Kyokushin fighters move when they're initiating, with forward pressure, the advance of a system built on the premise that you close distance and make your presence the dominant variable in the exchange. A front kick to set distance, real speed, the kind that had finished 11 tournament matches in 2 years of competition. Bruce was not where it went. The lateral movement he made was so small that from where I was standing, at the entrance to the room, I registered it more as a quality than an action, a presence that had been in one place and was now in a slightly different place. The transition between the 2 places, not visible to me as movement, so much as result. The kick completed its arc through the space where he had been. His right hand made contact with Dolph's extending right arm, the lightest possible contact at the inside of the forearm, and the momentum that the kick had generated found a different direction than it had intended, and Dolph stumbled forward into the space where Bruce had been. He caught himself. 1 foot forward, 1 hand briefly down, up, in under 2 seconds. Fast. The automatic response of someone for whom going to an awkward position and recovering from it is a daily practice. He turned. His face was doing something that I watched carefully from the entrance of the room, because what a person's face does in the first 2 seconds after they encounter something they weren't expecting tells you more about them than almost anything else. Dolph's face was doing the thing that very serious, very capable people's faces do when they receive genuine information about something they thought they understood. Which is to say, it went very still. The stillness of a processor running faster than normal because the normal speed isn't adequate for what's being processed. He came again. Different. The first approach had been what the competition record had built, the approach that had worked consistently. The second approach was what lay underneath the competition record, more direct, less patterned, the approach of someone who has decided that the available tools aren't working and is looking for what's available underneath them. He was fast. He was genuinely fast, and I want to be clear about that because the story is only true if that's true. At 6'5" and 240, moving with 6 years of daily full-contact training behind every step, Dolph Lundgren, in that staging area, was the most physically formidable thing I had been in a room with in my life, and it made no difference. Not because Bruce was faster, though he may have been, because the qualities that make physical formidability useful, reach, weight, speed, power, all assume that the thing you are applying them to is where you expect it to be when you apply them. The second approach found the same thing the first had found, which was that the place where Bruce was supposed to be when the force arrived was not where Bruce was. The contact this time was at Dolph's left shoulder, brief, the fingers of one hand, and the direction that brief contact introduced into Dolph's committed momentum sent him to the floor sideways, both hands catching himself on the rubber, one knee down. He stayed there longer than the first time. 5 seconds, 6. The staging area completely quiet, except for the sound of his breathing. Then he pushed up, stood. He was breathing through his nose, the controlled breath of a trained fighter managing a body that has just processed something unexpected. He looked at Bruce. If you think the 2 falls were the peak of what happened in that room, you have not heard what happened next, and what happened next is the part I have kept to myself for 52 years because it felt too private to share with anyone who wasn't in the room. Dolph said, "What are you doing?" Not a challenge, a question. The specific tone of the question when it comes from someone who genuinely needs an answer. Bruce said, "Showing you what you asked to see." Dolph said, "What did you do to my shoulder?" Bruce said, "You were already going sideways. I gave the sideways somewhere to finish." Dolph said, "You used my own momentum." Bruce said, "Yes." Dolph said, "I was moving toward you." Bruce said, "I know." Dolph said, "And you?" He stopped. He was looking at his own hands, the hands of a person who has spent 6 years learning what those hands can do, and is now encountering information that changes the inventory. He said, "You moved less than I did." Bruce said, "Yes." Dolph said, "By a lot." Bruce said, "Yes." Dolph was quiet for a moment. The crew members around the walls of the room had gone very still. The security people who had been making calls on their radios had stopped making calls. Somewhere in the building, somebody had apparently decided that what was happening here was going to happen regardless, and there was a specific decision not to decide that had settled over everyone in the room, the agreement by common consent to let the situation complete itself. Dolph said, "Do it again." Bruce said, "No." Dolph said, "Why?" Bruce said, "Because the third time doesn't teach you anything new. You already have what you came in here for." Dolph said, "I came in here to..." Bruce said, "You came in here because I refused to be what you decided I was before you had information about what I am. And now you have information. The third time wouldn't give you more information, it would just be repetition." Dolph was quiet. He said, "I didn't shake your hand." Bruce said, "No." He said, "On the stage." Bruce said, "I know." Dolph said, "I was wrong about what the hand was." He said it simply, directly, the kind of statement that costs something and knows it costs something and makes it anyway. Bruce said, "You were responding to what you believed. That's honest." Dolph said, "What I believed was that fame was the credential, that you were being presented to me as though fame and ability were the same thing, and I don't accept that equivalence." Bruce said, "I don't accept it either." Dolph said, "Then we agree." Bruce said, "We agree about the equivalence. We disagree about which side of it I'm on." Dolph said, "I understand that now." He said it looking at his hands again. Then he looked up. He said, "The handshake. Can I?" He put his hand out. Not the aggressive or performative thing that a proud person sometimes does when they are trying to reclaim something. A real handshake, the extension of a hand from someone who means what the gesture means. Bruce looked at it for a moment. Then he took it. They held it for a second longer than handshakes usually last, and what I was watching from the entrance to the room was 2 people who had spent the previous 40 minutes treating each other as something they had decided they were, and were now treating each other as something they had found out they were, which was different. Then the corridor outside the staging area became loud. I heard Fred de Cordova's voice first, and then at least two other voices, and then footsteps, more than one person, moving fast. Fred came through the entrance of the staging area and stopped when he saw what he saw, which was not the confrontation he had been expecting to find, but two people standing in the center of a rubber-floored room, holding a handshake. He stood there for a moment. Then he said, in the voice of a man who has been in television for 20 years and has developed the specific skill of receiving situations that don't match his expectations and immediately reorganizing his understanding of what he needs to do next. We have 6 minutes of segment left, and Johnny would like to know if anyone is interested in coming back to the stage. Dolph said yes. Bruce said yes. Fred looked at both of them. He said, good. He turned and walked back toward the corridor. Two security people appeared in the entrance to the staging area. They were large, and they had the look of people who had been moving fast and had arrived prepared for something and were now recalibrating. One of them said something into a radio. The other one looked at me, registered my presence, and said, "Sir, you need to come with me." I said, "I'm going." He walked me back through the corridor to the studio floor, where I returned to the 7th row and sat down. The man next to me, the American with his daughter, was turned in his seat watching the side entrance. His daughter was doing the same thing. He said, "Where were they?" I said, "Backstage." He said, "What happened?" I said, "I'll tell you after." The on-air light came back on. Johnny Carson was behind his desk, and he had on the expression of a man who has spent 11 years turning unexpected evenings into good television and is doing it again now. He said something about the break, and something about continuing the conversation, and the cameras showed the couch where both guests were now seated. They both looked different from how they had looked before the break, not dramatically different, the specific kind of different that happens to people who have been through something and come out the other side of it. Dolph looked slightly less contained than he had in the first segment, something in him less organized around the position he had walked out with. Bruce looked the same, which was its own kind of different in context, the way stillness is different when it sits next to something that is moved. Johnny asked Dolph a question about what had come up in the conversation, something diplomatic, something designed to give Dolph a direction towards something that could close the segment rather than extend it. Dolph said, "I want to say something before we talk about anything else." Johnny said, "Go ahead." Dolph said, "When Bruce came out on this stage tonight and offered me his hand, I didn't take it. I wanted to say why I did that, and I want to say what I think about it now." The room was very quiet, he said. "I train in a system where respect is expressed through what you can demonstrate in real conditions, not through reputation or fame." I looked at Bruce's hand and I thought, I don't know what that hand has done. I know what it looks like on a screen. I made a judgment based on what I knew, which was incomplete. I was wrong about the judgment, and I was wrong about what the gesture meant, and I want to say that directly while we're on television, rather than after. He looked at Bruce. He said, "The handshake was deserved." Bruce said, "I appreciate that." He said it simply, without performing the grace of it, without anything that drew attention to how he was receiving the apology. Then he said, "What Dolph is describing is the real version of what martial arts respect is supposed to mean, not social convention, not ceremony, earned recognition. He applied that standard correctly. The only thing he was wrong about was the information he applied it to. He didn't have enough of it yet." He looked at Dolph. He said, "Now he does." The audience produced the sound that 400 people produce when something has resolved in a way they found more satisfying than what they came expecting. Not applause exactly. The sound that precedes applause, the intake that becomes applause when it finds direction. Johnny let it develop. He looked at the camera with the specific expression of a host who has watched something happen on his stage that he could not have planned and has decided the only response to it is genuine. He said, "I have been doing this show for 11 years. In 11 years I have sat at this desk with an extraordinary number of extraordinary people, and what I just watched on this stage tonight is the first time I have seen two men have that particular conversation, out loud, on live television, in front of everyone." He paused. "That is the rarest thing." The audience applauded. The last 5 minutes of the segment were the easiest 5 minutes of the evening. Johnny asked both of them about what they were working on, about where they were heading, the forward-looking questions that close a show. Dolph talked about competition, about what he was building toward. Bruce talked about what he was trying to do with martial arts in film, about the bridge between what the training actually was and what audiences understood it to be. At one point, Johnny asked Dolph what he made of the evening overall, and Dolph said, "I came in with a position. I left with something more accurate." That's the best thing that can happen in a conversation. The credits rolled. The man next to me in the 7th row said, "That was something." I said, "Yes." His daughter said, "Did he really not shake his hand?" At the beginning. I said, no. She said, and then he did. At the end. I said yes. She thought about this for a moment. Then she said, that's a better story than if he'd just shaken hands from the start. I thought about that on the drive home. I thought about it for several nights after. She was right, I decided. The refusal was part of what made the handshake mean something. The evening would not have produced what it produced if Dolph had done the easy thing at the beginning. The easy thing would have produced a pleasant conversation between two martial arts practitioners that no one would have remembered by the following week. What actually happened was harder and realer, and it produced something that 400 people in a studio and 12 million people at home got to watch, which was two people meeting each other at the level of what they actually were, rather than what they had initially decided the other one was. I am 85 years old. I have been carrying this for 52 years, and I have never told the complete version, because the complete version included the staging area, and the staging area felt like it belonged to the people who were in it. I am telling it now because I am 85 years old, and I have decided that a true story deserves to be complete. Bruce Lee died 8 months after that evening. He was 32 years old. I heard the news at work, and I sat at my desk for a while, without doing anything. I thought about the staging area, about the two falls, and the look on Dolph's face after each one, and the question how, and the answer you were already going sideways. I just gave the sideways somewhere to finish. About the handshake in the staging area, the real one, before they went back on stage. About what it looked like from the entrance to the room, two people who had just found out what the other one actually was. I thought about the 7-row seat and the man next to me and his daughter. I thought about what she said. That's a better story than if he'd just shaken hands from the start. She was right. It was a better story. And it was a true one. That's what I have. That's the whole thing. I was there.